Before we begin, a quick warning. Tennessee True Crime contains detailed descriptions and images of real-life violence. Some listeners and viewers may find the content deeply disturbing. This content is intended for mature audiences only. And remember, the goal of sharing these stories is not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor the victims, understand the truth, and give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. Listener discretion is strongly advised. There are crimes that erupt in chaos, and there are crimes that unfold quietly, deliberately, while the rest of the city sleeps. This story belongs to the second kind. In late 1988, while Chattanooga went dark each night and families locked their doors, one man roamed the city looking for opportunity. He described it later as a feeling, a state that he said he just could not resist. A drive that didn't fade until someone was hurt. You'll hear his name in 100 headlines. You'll hear the dates, nights in late 1988 and early 1989, a small string of calendar squares that mark a city's loss of sleep. But those squares hide lives, friends who kept looking for phone calls that never came, bodies and bruises, and a family that waited for answers for decades. And of the women who survived this monster, who took her from this world. And of what happens when violence escalates unchecked, until the only question left is how it ends. Her family would spend the next 3 decades chasing a long arc of justice. This is the story of Karen Elise Pulley. They say the South never forgets, and Tennessee, she remembers everything. Welcome to Tennessee True Crime, where the shadows of the volunteer state's past meet the stories that refuse to be forgotten. I'm your host, Tiffany Morgan. Each week, we dig into twisted tales of betrayal, violence, and mystery, the ones where whispers carry truth and the answers are never as simple as they seem. Let's step into the dark and piece together the clues, because in Tennessee, some secrets still haunt the hills. This is Tennessee True Crime.
Down through the smoky hollers where the cold wind sighs, footsteps fall where the moonlight hides, whispers over rivers, a secret lost in time. Welcome to Tennessee True Crime.
So, before Karen Pulley became a name in a court opinion, before her case was reduced to evidence numbers and autopsy findings, she was a 21-year-old woman with roommates, plans, and a future that still felt wide open. She was young and vibrant, studying to be a paralegal, remembered by her family as bubbly and selfless. Karen lived in the Brainerd area of Chattanooga, Tennessee, in a house that she shared with 2 other roommates. She was young and independent and at a stage of life where safety still felt assumed, not something that had to be earned every single night. What's important to understand about the Brainerd area in 1988 is this: it was not considered dangerous at the time. This wasn't a high crime area. It wasn't a place where people double-checked their locks out of fear. It was the kind of neighborhood where young adults lived with their roommates, worked their jobs, went to school, and assumed, reasonably, that their home meant safety. Karen Pulley wasn't reckless. She wasn't careless. She was living the kind of life that thousands of young women were living across Tennessee at the time. And that matters because narratives often try to rewrite the victim's choices after the fact. The court record is clear, though. There was no evidence that Karen invited this violence in any way. The danger didn't come from her decisions. It came from someone else's. Now, on the evening of September 30th, 1988, Karen was at home alone. There was nothing about that night that marked it as dangerous, no warning, no sign that it would be the last night of her life. Sometime after dark, a man broke into her house. He moved through it quietly, deliberately. He found Karen upstairs in her bedroom. What happened next would later be reconstructed through physical evidence, medical testimony, and, most chillingly, the man's own words. The prosecution would later emphasize that Karen's injuries told a story even before the man opened his mouth. Medical testimony described blunt force trauma consistent with repeated strikes, not a single blow, not a moment of panic, but sustained violence over time. Defensive wounds showed that she tried to protect herself. She resisted. And in cases like this, resistance often changes the trajectory, not toward mercy, but toward escalation. The court noted that the severity of the injuries was far beyond what would have been necessary to incapacitate someone. This wasn't about escape. This was about total domination. He tore her undergarments from her body. He raped her violently. Karen fought back, and that resistance mattered, not because it saved her, but because it enraged him. Now, inside the house, the defendant picked up a 2x4, a piece of wood that did not belong there. It was something improvised and something heavy. He struck her in the head at least twice. But even then, the violence did not stop. While Karen struggled, he hit her again, multiple times, with extreme force. The blows were deliberate and sustained and devastating. When he finally left, Karen was still alive, but barely. That detail, that Karen was still alive when he left, would haunt the case, because it meant that she endured not only the attack, but the aftermath. Minutes, possibly hours. The medical examiner later testified that while her injuries were catastrophic, death was not instantaneous. There was suffering, and there was time, and there was no one there to help her yet. Now, the next morning, one of Karen's roommates came home. She went upstairs, and what she found would stay with her for the rest of her life. Karen was lying on the floor. Karen was lying on the floor next to her bed, alive but unresponsive, surrounded by blood. The scene was absolutely catastrophic. There was no mistaking the severity of her injuries. Karen was rushed to the hospital for medical care. Emergency responders described the scene as one of the most violent they had encountered. Doctors worked to stabilize the brain swelling. Karen was placed on life support. Family members gathered, hoping for some sign, any sign, that she might wake up, but she never did. The court record notes that Karen Pulley remained unconscious from the time she was discovered until her death the following day. There were no final words, no identification of her attacker, no opportunity for her to testify. Her silence wasn't a lack of truth. It was taken from her. They tried and they tried to save her, but they couldn't. Now, for months, the case stalled. There was no physical evidence tying a suspect to the crime, no eyewitnesses, no known connection between Karen and her attacker. Her murder threatened to become one of those cases that quietly fade, painful but unresolved and unanswered. This wasn't unusual for the late 1980s. DNA testing, as we know it today, was still in its infancy. There were no consumer databases, no rapid forensic hits, and investigators relied on shoe leather police work, patterns and tips and interviews and their own intuition. And what finally broke the case wasn't technology, it was behavior.
One.
3 months later, in January of 1989, a Chattanooga police detective questioned a man who was already in custody on a completely unrelated charge, not Karen Pulley's murder. He was there through the Eastridge Police Department. Now, after Karen's murder, Chattanooga police began to see connections between different assaults there in the city. And for months, they had been chasing a pattern. Chattanooga police had begun to notice there were similarities across multiple of these assaults. There was forced entry into residences, attacks occurring late at night, victims who were alone, and rapid escalation of violence. What investigators later testified to is that Karen Pulley's murder wasn't the beginning of the pattern. It was the turning point that made them realize how dangerous it had already become. The case consolidated into a larger investigation, and witness statements also began to point to a suspect. He was arrested on January 5th, 1989, following a tip, one that, according to reporting in court records, came from someone in his own social circle. His name was Harold Wayne Nichols. And during questioning, much to everyone's surprise, Nichols confessed. He admitted to breaking into Karen Pulley's home. He admitted to raping her. He admitted to beating her with a 2x4. That confession was videotaped. Now, videotaped confessions in the late 1980s were still relatively uncommon, but this one mattered because Harold Wayne Nichols didn't hedge, he didn't minimize, and he didn't suggest that it was an accident. He described details that investigators believed only the attacker could know. Details about the house and the weapon and the sequence of events. And while confessions alone are scrutinized heavily in capital cases, appellate courts later emphasized that Harold Wayne Nichols' confession was internally consistent and corroborated by the physical evidence. It wasn't just statement, it was alignment. And critically, it became the only direct link between Harold Wayne Nichols and Karen Pulley's rape and murder. There was no DNA tying him to the scene, no fingerprints recovered that conclusively placed him there, just his words. And yet, that fact would follow the case for decades. Because words can be recanted, but evidence can't. The defense would later argue that the absence of forensic proof made the case fragile. The prosecution countered with something simpler. Harold Wayne Nichols had no incentive to fabricate a murder that carried the death penalty. The courts agreed. As investigators dug deeper, Karen Pulley's case stopped looking isolated. Nichols hadn't been dormant before her death, and he hadn't stopped afterwards. Evidence showed that until that arrest in January 1989, Harold Wayne Nichols had roamed Chattanooga at night, actively searching for vulnerable women. What's chilling is how methodical this became for him. Nichols wasn't lashing out randomly. He wasn't confined to one neighborhood. He learned from each crime and he adapted. Court records show that he changed weapons, he changed locations, he changed tactics, all indicators of someone learning from experience. That adaptability was a major factor in the jury's sentencing decision. He would later describe a sensation, a buildup, an internal pressure, a drive that he said overwhelmed him when he became, quote, energized. And when that feeling took hold, he went looking, hunting. Over the next months, December 1988 to January 1989, a pattern emerges in the court record and in indictments. Multiple victims, different weapons, different means of forcing compliance, but the same brutal outcome for the women involved. Physical and emotional trauma that would not simply heal with conviction on paper. Court records list offenses in close succession. December 21st, 1988, December 27th, 1988, January 3rd, 1989. Clustered dates that show a concentrated span of violence. Now, on December 21st, 1988, court filings show an indictment charging the defendant with feloniously engaging in sexual penetration, vaginal intercourse, with a woman identified in the record only as PAG, by the use of force or coercion while the defendant was armed with a knife. At trial, Harold Wayne Nichols pled not guilty, but a jury would later convict him on that count of aggravated rape. On December 27, 1988, the record shows another indictment, this one naming a victim identified only as TR. The charge was sexual penetration by the use of force or coercion while Harold Wayne Nichols was armed with a cord. In that case, Nichols pled guilty to aggravated rape. On January 3rd, 1989, two separate indictments appear on this date in the files. One involves ST, accused of being subjected to anal intercourse by the use of force or coercion while Harold Wayne Nichols was armed with a pistol. The defendant pled guilty to aggravated rape. The second victim of that day involves a victim identified as PAR. Harold Wayne Nichols was charged in the indictments with multiple acts of sexual penetration, fellatio and vaginal intercourse, and the jury convicted him of aggravated rape on those counts. 2 women in one day. That's just sick. When you read the indictments and the judgment entries, what strikes you is not the legal phrasing. It's the cadence, the instruments of control, cord, knife, pistol, each instrument a phrase in the same brutal sentence. The court record showed some pleas and some not guilties, and a jury that, of course, convicted where he denied responsibility. But for each entry on a docket, there was a person whose life was absolutely rearranged. This was not impulsive violence, it was serial. Now, these all occurred within 3 months of Karen's death. And those convictions represented only a portion of the violence. It's worth noting, and the court record emphasizes this, that the spree was not limited to the 4 victims whose initials appear in the earlier indictments that we just discussed. Federal and appellate findings later stated that Nichols had been charged with or linked to a larger number, at least a dozen, of rapes and attempted rapes in a 3-month span. Those additional offenses formed part of the background, part of the reason that prosecutors argued for severe punishment. 12 women. And here's the hardest part to sit with. Those 12 women represent only the assaults that made it into formal charging or were referenced in appellate filings. Experts will tell you serial sexual violence is almost always underreported. So when prosecutors said at least a dozen, what they're really saying is that's only what we can prove. Now, I'm both shocked and not shocked that he was still out roaming the streets. I'm also furious about the same. I mean, how many women's lives were forever changed because he wasn't locked up? Would Karen Pulley still be alive? Now, at the trial, the defense attempted to explain not excuse the violence. They spoke of Harold Wayne Nichols' childhood, early loss, time in institutional care, a troubled family background, all elements the defense introduced to humanize him and argue for mercy. His mother died of breast cancer when he was just 10 years old. He and his sister were placed in an orphanage for 6 years. He was nearly adopted, but then returned to his father, a father described as emotionally abusive. In 1984, Nichols pled guilty to attempted rape. That prior conviction mattered enormously because it eliminated the argument that this violence came out of nowhere. Nichols had already crossed this line once, and he'd been given another chance. The jury heard that, and they weighed it. And they concluded that escalation wasn't theoretical, it was documented. Now, on that 1984 attempted rape charge, he served 18 months. He violated parole and then served more time. By 1988, he was married. This is why you stalk somebody's background before you get into a relationship with them. Employed as a first assistant manager at Godfather's Pizza. Now, the psychological testimony became one of the most debated aspects of this case. Dr. Ingham told the jury that Harold Wayne Nichols experienced a mounting internal pressure, a drive that became irresistible and resulted in violent actions. He described Nichols as someone who could function normally in a structured environment, someone who followed rules, someone who did well under supervision. But, and this was critical, he also testified that if Harold Wayne Nichols were released into the community, the violent behavior would almost certainly recur. Now, that testimony cut both ways, because while it suggested diminished control, it also suggested permanent danger. The state challenged Ingham's credibility, pointing out that he was not a neutral evaluator, but he was part of the defense team. They argued that Nichols' actions showed planning. He chose nighttime. He targeted isolated women. He used different weapons and leaving scenes without detection. That is not loss of control. That is strategy. Now, perhaps the most damaging evidence against Nichols wasn't forensic. It was his honesty. On the stand, as we said before, Nichols did not deny what he had done. He did not shift the blame. He did not claim innocence. Instead, he explained himself. He talked about that feeling, that energized state that overtook him before each and every attack. He said it came to him without warning, that it built up inside of him, and that once it arrived, he could not stop. And then he said something prosecutors would never let the jury forget. He said that if he had not been arrested, he would have continued violently attacking many more women. That statement transformed the whole case. It reframed Harold Wayne Nichols not as someone haunted by past actions, but as someone stopped only by incarceration. Remorse in that context kind of becomes complicated. Now, a defense expert diagnosed Nichols with intermittent explosive disorder, a rare condition involving uncontrollable violent outburst. The prosecution challenged that testimony aggressively, pointing out the expert's dual role as both lawyer and evaluator. The jury listened. They deliberated just 2 hours. 2 hours. After weeks of testimony, after hearing from experts and victims, investigators, and Harold Wayne Nichols himself, that time frame speaks volumes. It suggests not confusion, but clarity. The verdict was death. 2 statutory aggravating factors, a pattern of escalating violence, a murdered young woman who never got the chance to grow older. This isn't where the story ends, because the most chilling question in this case isn't why he did it. It was how long it took to stop him. When the jury returned with a sentence of death, the courtroom didn't erupt. There was no chaos. There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse, just quiet. And that silence mattered because it reflected the weight of what had been decided. Not just punishment for a crime, but a final judgment on a pattern of violence that had spanned months and shattered multiple lives. For Karen Pulley's family, the verdict closed one chapter, but it did not bring her back. For the women who survived Nichols' attacks, it did not erase what they had endured. And for the legal system, it marked the beginning of a long, methodical process that would stretch decades into the future. Because as we know, a death sentence is never immediate. It lingers. Now, Harold Wayne Nichols appealed his death sentence, as nearly all capital defendants do. Not the facts of what happened, but whether the law had been applied correctly. His appeals argued several points. Whether the jury had been improperly influenced, whether the mitigation evidence was adequately considered, whether Nichols' psychological condition should have weighed more heavily against death. Now, at the heart of these appeals was the same question that surfaces in nearly every death penalty case. Was the defendant too damaged to deserve the ultimate punishment? The courts examined the record carefully. They reviewed Nichols' own testimony, including his admission that if he had not been arrested, he would have continued attacking women. They reviewed the testimony of Dr. Eric Ingham, who diagnosed Nichols with intermittent explosive disorder, a condition characterized by that uncontrolled violent impulse. And they reviewed the prosecution's rebuttal, which emphasized not impulse, but patterns. But after decades of litigation, the convictions and the sentence, including the death penalty for the 1988 murder of Karen Elise Pulley, ultimately remained intact. The jury's message was clear. This was not a crime of impulse. It was a choice repeated over and over and over until it ended a life. In capital cases, the victim of the murder often dominates the narrative, but the court records in this case refuse to let the others disappear. The women identified only by initials, PAG, TR, ST, PAR. They appear again and again in filings, testimony, and judgments. Their assaults were not footnotes. They were proof of escalation. Each incident showed increasing confidence. Each weapon showed adaptability. Each attack showed learning. The jury was allowed to consider those convictions not as a character assassination, but as evidence of a continuing threat. And again, at least 12 women had been named in connection to Harold Wayne Nichols' actions. 12 at least. Karen Pulley was the only one who didn't survive him. Now, years went by, and Harold Wayne Nichols lived on death row in a controlled, regimented environment exactly like the one Dr. Ingham described. Multiple appellate opinions later noted the irony of this fact, that the environment in which Nichols committed no further violence was the very one that removed his access to victims. Structure didn't cure him, it contained him. He became, by many accounts, compliant, quiet. Some described him as polite, others as withdrawn. Now, for the families and the survivors, time does not heal. Every appeal reopened the case. Every hearing dragged names back into public view. Every delay forced them to relive what had already been proven. This is the part of capital punishment rarely discussed. Not the execution, but the waiting. Decades of it. Now, the legal system ultimately upheld Nichols' sentence. Courts found no reversible error, no constitutional violation, no reason to overturn the jury's decision, and so the sentence remained. But justice is not a single moment. For Karen Pulley's family, justice meant accountability, not closure. For survivors, justice meant being believed and seeing their attacker never walk free again. For the state, justice meant enforcing the law as it's written. And for the rest of us, the listeners, justice becomes a question. What do we do with someone who says they cannot stop? Harold Wayne Nichols once said that he was afraid to ask for help because he feared losing everything. But in the end, he lost it all anyway. His marriage, his freedom, his future. But long before that, others lost something far more irreplaceable. Karen Pulley lost her life. And the women who survived lost something invisible: safety, trust, the ability to exist in the world without fearing calculated danger. Those losses don't expire with a sentence. They echo. As the long road of appeals and litigation finally wound down, the state of Tennessee scheduled Harold Wayne Nichols' execution for December 11th, 2025, more than 35 years after his conviction and death sentence were handed down. In the hours before his execution at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Nichols was offered the traditional last meal available to death row inmates in Tennessee. According to official records, he requested beef brisket, coleslaw, a baked potato, onion rings, deviled eggs, and cheese biscuits with fruit tea. Now, those meals, in a grim way, mark a final human moment between the long years on death row and the irreversible act of execution. A moment that is often scrutinized in discussions about the death penalty itself. In his final statement delivered just before the lethal injection, Nichols spoke directly to the impact of his own actions. And he said, "To the people I've harmed, I'm sorry. To my family, know that I love you. I know where I'm going. I'm ready to go home." Those final words, an expression of remorse, a nod to his faith, and an acknowledgement of the lives he shattered, underscored the complex emotions that swirl around cases like this. For some, they are genuine. For others, too late. The execution of Nichols did not pass quietly. While many in Karen Pulley's family felt a sense of relief that the man responsible for her death would never harm another person again, there were also voices outside the courtroom, outside the prison walls, raising uncomfortable but important questions about the cost and value of executing someone after so many decades. At the site of the execution and in media coverage across Tennessee, protesters and advocates against capital punishment made a point that resonates in many states with active death penalty systems. They argued that the death penalty does not truly serve justice, and that it turns into a long, drawn-out expense on the public dime. Protesters echoed sentiments like, "Murder does not erase murder," "Taking another life will not solve the issues," Taxpayer money should be directed to victims' families, mental health services, and prevention, not decades of litigation and execution costs. Now, these criticisms are not unique to Harold Wayne Nichols' case. Across the country, debates about capital punishment increasingly include cost analysis, showing that death penalty cases, from prosecution through appeals all the way to execution, often cost millions more than life imprisonment without parole. While many jurisdictions justify these costs on moral or deterrent grounds, opponents argue that taxpayers are left footing a bill that yields no real closure for survivors and does nothing to heal communities. Now, whether one agrees or disagrees with the death penalty as a practice, these voices remind us that every time the state moves toward an execution, the conversation isn't just about punishment. It's also about public resources, societal values, and who we ask to carry the burden of a violent crime long after it happens. Now, cases like this force us to sit with the discomfort. There is no clean moral ending. There is no version of this story where everyone wins, only one where the violence stops. And sometimes, painfully, that is the only resolution left. This case is not about fascination with evil. It's about recognizing patterns, believing survivors, and understanding how quickly unchecked violence can escalate from assault to murder. And this is where the case leaves us, not with comfort and not with resolution, but with responsibility. Because Karen Pulley's murder didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened after warning signs, after prior convictions, after missed opportunities to intervene. Remembering her means more than recounting what was done to her. It means understanding what allowed it to happen and what must never be ignored again. Now, Karen Pulley was 21 years old. She was so loved. She had dreams, she had plans, and a life that should have extended far beyond that single September night. Her name deserves to be remembered, not as evidence, not as a case number, but as a person. If you or someone you know has experienced sexual violence, resources are available. You are not alone, and help does not require silence. I want to thank you guys for listening in again. We have made it to the last show of 2025, and I just want to take a minute to thank every single one of you who have followed me from the beginning of this show in late October, those of you who have listened on the radio, watched on Facebook or YouTube, those who have shared my episodes, commented, liked, and invited their friends to do the same. I love all of your feedback, and I especially love when you guys come up and talk to me about a case in person. That just tickles me to death. You will never know how much this has meant to me, and I'm so excited to continue on in 2026 with you guys. This episode, Energized, was written and hosted by me, Tiffany Morgan, and produced by Main Street Media. Background music and theme song by John T. Productions. Research support from Court Archives, Justia Law, and CBS News. If you would like to sponsor an episode, we would love to partner with you. Our sponsors keep our shows funded and running. To support Tennessee True Crime, follow us on Facebook at Tennessee True Crime and Instagram at TN True Crime. You can find case and evidence photos on those socials as well. Now, if you have a case that you're interested in me covering, please feel free to email me at tntruecrime@mainstreetmedia.llc. Join me next week as we uncover another Tennessee case that left a lasting mark. Because here in Tennessee, we never stop telling the stories that matter. And some secrets we refuse to let stay buried. Tune in next time on Tennessee True Crime. Have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Down to through the smoky hollers where the cold wind sighs. Footsteps fall where the moonlight hides. Whispers over rivers, a secret lost in time. Welcome to Tennessee. True crime. Dark tales in the mountains where the mist won't lie. Echoes of the fallen under starless skies. Hear the hush of memory, the voice of the unsaid. This is Tennessee true crime, where the shadows